Hello, hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Ah, yes, beautiful. We, I'll just um get people's attention. Um, 1 second.
I can hear you too, Sam. It's good. Thanks, everyone.
Uh, Hello, kia ora, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. No mai, haere mai. Feel free to grab a seat. There are also other seats over there. We're gonna start the Zoom. We have Áine, Kelly-Costello, Áine, sorry, and Jonathan Mosen. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you hear me all good?
Yeah.
Yes, all good.
Awesome, cool. Right, so I just kind of wanted to start off, first of all, and ask you both kind of, where did your kind of like advocacy journey begin? What kind of sparked it off?
Who would you like to start first, Sam?
I reckon you go.
All right, I'll give it a shot. I think my advocacy journey actually started when I was the victim of abuse at the School for the Blind. And I last year testified to the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care about that process, and really began to realize that it was important to speak up. In a more formal sense, it started when I was 16 years old. And in those days, I used to hang around a bit, although I was at a mainstream high school. I did have some services that I received at the School for the Blind. And we had some blind adults who worked there at the transcription department. I have an older blind brother as well, so I knew a little bit about some of the argy-bargy that was going on in those days between the Foundation for the Blind, as it was then, and the consumer movement. And when I was 16, one of the blind adults said, "We're going to take you to a meeting of the association," which is now Blind Citizens New Zealand, "because you've got to give something back to blind people with the skills that you've got to give something back." And so that's really where it started officially, when I went to my first Auckland branch meeting when I was 16 years old.
Yeah, that's thanks for sharing that, Jonathan, and thanks for naming them, speaking up about the abuse you experience at Homai School for the Blind as well. So for me, if I think back, I guess, when you grow up, at least if you are like me and have quite like onto it parents, have the privilege of that. When you're younger, your parents are taking a lot of that advocacy. And then as you get older, you start to notice when things aren't fair. Like, I think one of the sort of earliest times that I really remember noticing and starting to speak up myself, as well as my parents doing that, was when I was in kind of year 7 and 8. And I remember I wasn't allowed to join the senior jazz band because I couldn't sight read, so I couldn't, read print music, even though I had actually quite good Braille music skills and was quite able to keep up if the music was given in time. Or when I was pretty much point blank told, in fact, I wasn't told, they called my mother and told her instead of telling me, but that the school didn't want me in the musical production, or rather that they thought so hard about it, but they couldn't possibly think of a way for a blind person to be involved. So I think there were instances like that I sort of remember that injustice, as opposed to, for example, I learned as an adult that my parents had to fight for me to be able to get a student visa and residency because I got, education support funding as a kid, and under the immigration rules that we have here called the acceptable standard of health, if you get that funding, you're deemed to be, a cost to our education services. And they try very hard to keep disabled people and people with health conditions out. So something like that was, my parents did that and sheltered me from it. And then basically as an adult, or as a uni student, I got more into climate activism, learned more about campaigning, and got more involved in the disability community at that point, sort of 6 years ago or something. Yeah.
And where did you kind of start doing like public speaking, and then you're like, oh, maybe broadcast or podcasting would be a good way to share your voice?
I got involved in radio at a ridiculously early age. As soon as I learned how to dial the telephone, and there was a dial back then, I started calling into talkback radio when I was about 4 years old, and was on the radio right throughout my childhood, which was a bit difficult in some ways because, Auckland was a much smaller community in a way then, because there were only about 6 radio stations. So a lot of people knew who I was. And as soon as they realized there was a blind kid called Jonathan around, they knew that it was me. And there was a lot of scrutiny that came with that in retrospect. It wasn't particularly easy growing up in public. But I was absolutely determined to have a career in radio. And I went to the career counselor that the Blind Foundation employed in those days. And I said, how do I do this? And they said, you can't. Radio is becoming a lot more computerized, and it's not going to be possible for a blind person to do radio. So I don't like being told something like that. If someone tells me I can't do something, it makes me more inclined to want to. So I decided to take control of the situation, and I set up, you had to apply for a license in those days, which was a really arduous process. But I applied for a license from an entity called the Broadcasting Tribunal, and got a license to set up a radio station at the School for the Blind. And I didn't want it to be charitable. So we went out and we raised commercial revenue. We sold advertising to pay to hire all the gear. And then when we'd done that and the radio station was about to get going, I contacted everybody I could think of in the radio industry to say, hey, come and see blind people doing radio. And they did. And we had a lot of radio people come out. And the upshot of all of that was that when it was time to look for a career in radio, I knew everybody and they knew me. And it was actually really easy to get on the radio. And I worked in commercial radio in the 90s, which was a really crazy deregulated market. But it was a really great time. But yeah, initially I did music and talk radio, and then obviously moved on from commercial radio eventually to doing blindness specific community radio.
That's really interesting to hear your journey with that, Jonathan. For me, I was thinking about this when you were talking about the networks that you had that sort of enabled you to get that career pathway more easily, because I ended up working on a campaign for accessibility law in 2017 and 2018. And that campaign in many ways gave me an excuse to build up not just professional relationships, but also a broader sense of interest and friendships within the wider disability community. Sometimes I might not have actually reached out to people, even if I kind of was interested, because it just felt weird or whatever, without having a kind of a reason to do that. And then when I ended up doing an internship as a journalist at the end of 2018, we still have a problem with there not being enough disability-related news coverage, but it was certainly quite noticeable back then as well. And I had those networks in the disability community, and had built up, I think, some trust there, even though I was new to journalism. And so that meant that I was in a position in that internship to cover, various things, particularly within the disability community that were otherwise not getting reported on. I did not have that kind of connection to audio or radio much growing up. I did listen to the radio a little bit, but I guess I read a lot of sort of text-based stuff as well. But I think it was just through that aspect of storytelling, through wanting to be able to connect with other disabled people and share stories, that I could have branched out from the digital or, writing-based journalism to also do some audio and video work, still interviewing disabled people and basically just having conversations where people were able to share their lived experience. And I found that really fulfilling.
And like, I often think about kind of who is this for? Is it for non-disabled people or kind of like disabled folk? How do you kind of choose? Like, do you kind of choose to advocate and educate people who might not know much about accessibility, or do you try to do both, or try to do it in a way that's like, oh, this is just for us? Yeah.
That's a really interesting question, and I really strongly agree with Áine that even though we've had marvelous trailblazers in recent years, and I think of Olivia Shivers in particular, who's just done some astoundingly good work in this space, we still don't get disability issues frequently reported. When they are, they're often misreported. So there's so much good work to be done, and we need more disabled people in those key change agent positions. That's something that I'm passionate about. In terms of the way that we use media, when I first got in radio, I was just doing politics and regular current affairs. I had a morning breakfast show where I would interview the politicians of the day. This was the early 1990s, so Sir Robert Muldoon was still just around then. And if I had to interview him, I'd definitely have a very, very large cup of coffee, because he was scary even then. It was a fascinating time to do mainstream radio, because that was the Bolger national government, the just absolutely atrocious hacking into benefits, the hospital system. They became Crown Health enterprises. It was an extraordinarily turbulent time. But when it comes to the work that I do now in terms of podcasting, for me, it's unashamedly our place. It's the blind community's place. My podcast is called Living Blindfully, and we have listeners in 113 countries now at last count, and it's a very large audience by blind community standards. And I just wanted to, and this is what I've been doing for the last 25 years online, actually. It'll be 25 years in December. I just wanted to start something where it was uniquely our place. We didn't have to explain ourselves. We didn't have to put on pretenses. We just could have a global forum where we could talk about things that matter to us and exchange tips and hints and tricks and be totally us. Now, there is definitely a place for explaining disability and a range of impairments to the non-disabled. That's a very important role, but I kind of feel like I found my particular niche.
Yep, Jonathan's pretty much answered that one. I think it depends on the publication, on the audience, on all those things, and there's a role for all of it. But I would say for myself as well, I really appreciate being able to work in a disability community centered way, where the stories that we're sharing are the stories that we want to share first and foremost for each other. It doesn't mean that non-disabled people can't listen or can't, read and watch and stuff, but we are centering ourselves. And I think there's a lot of power in doing that.
Yeah, I just interject briefly, Sam, before your next question, to say something extraordinary happened to me about 3 weeks ago. I was in a meeting and it was completely not related to disability at all. And somebody came up to me and said, "You do the Living Blindfully podcast?" And I said, "Yeah, that's right." And this person said, "I listened to it. I really enjoy it." And this is a sighted person who has no engagement with the disability community. It was just the most random thing. So you never know who you're reaching, people with a bit of curiosity, a bit of interest to find out, how do we tick? What are our issues? it really took me aback, and it made me feel really glad that that's happening.
I'll just say one more thing as well, if I can, on that. On the other sort of side of the ledger, I suppose, what Johnson was saying before about working in mainstream radio and, just following other interests that might not be connected to disability, or where there could be connections to disability, but we're just not focusing on them at that time. It's really important that we're not pigeonholed as disabled people in that way. And, I can think, for example, of a time when I had done my thesis on climate change journalism, and, I'd interviewed journalists for that. And then somebody was doing a podcast episode where they were interviewing me about my thesis. And at the beginning of the podcast, and unbeknownst to me, they'd started recording and they didn't edit it out. They didn't tell me, but they asked me something like, oh, as a blind person, how do you use this software, and how do you do audio editing, and I guess they'd look me up online, right? And I expected that they would edit that out. It felt like such a sidetrack, and it felt a little inappropriate. And so, I think it's important as well that we are able to be reflected in whatever kaupapa basically that we want to be focusing on, kind of on our terms, and that it's not everything is just sort of dragged around to disability for the sake of it, because that definitely felt weird enough that I was almost like uncomfortable about sharing that episode, even though the rest of the conversation was fine, because it just opens in such a random way.
Yeah, that is so true. I'm a chief executive these days, and it happens to be of a disability-based organization because it interests me. I feel called to make a difference. And because a lot of the work that I've done in recent years has been in disability organizations, you do get pigeonholed. And even though being a chief executive and managing a team that has about 120 staff around the country in 22 offices, those skills are absolutely transferable skills. It's all about leadership and management and strategic thinking and all those things. But somehow people think that because I'm disabled and a chief executive of a disability provider, that's all one can do. And it is frustrating. The other thing I'd share too, it was a really interesting thing. I didn't mention very often when I was working on commercial radio that I was blind, because it just wasn't relevant. But for some reason, on one particular occasion, I was doing an editorial or something, and it was mentioned, worthy of me mentioning it. And I played a commercial or something, and I got a phone call from this woman, from this listener, and she said, "Did you just say that you were blind?" I said, "Yes, that's right." She said, "You don't sound blind." How do you expect me to sound? So it's funny, the little preconceptions that people have.
That's great. I just wanted to quickly pause. Does anyone in the audience have a question they'd like to ask? No? No? What's... Yeah.
One thing I feel we should do at some stage is we should allow everyone to introduce themselves.
Right.
I'm aware we've probably got about 5 or 6 blind people in the audience.
Yeah.
And it would be really good to know who else here.
Yeah, I think so. That we've got NZSL interpreters at the moment, and not sure how much time in that, but I think at some point, yep, that would be great. Anyway, what's your favorite podcast?
I like a lot of political podcasts. So I listen to a thing called Countdown with Keith Olbermann from the US, which used to be a long time ago on MSNBC, and he got too hot for them. So now he's on he's on his own podcast. What else do I listen? I actually consume a lot of news this way because I can just speed it up and listen to the items that interest me. So I do listen to Morning Report that way when I'm brave enough to risk all the ableist language that comes out of Morning Report, and some of the other media as well. I do also. I'm a real fan in recent times of meditation and mindfulness. So I listen to quite a few. There's one called 10% Happier that I find really helpful. Those are the things I can immediately think of right now? I'm sure you have a better list, Áine. You've got a better list.
No, I don't do favorite podcasts or favorite anything questions very well either. I listen to a bunch of kind of disability related stuff and also wider kind of activism and campaigning things. Like there's a cool podcast called Movement Memos that it's mainly interviews within the US, but interviews people doing various activism sort of stuff. And the disabilities, I listen to Living Blindfully, of course, but
Thanks.
the disability visibility podcast that Alice Wong and other disabled people hosted and worked on, which is not going anymore, but that's a really good series of interviews with disabled people there. Just some real Māori stuff in English because I'm not fluent, but there's one Everyday Māori with Hemi Kelly, which is cool. And yeah, some news and politics and all kinds of things, but they're probably some of the main themes. Also some maybe more explicitly mindfulness stuff ones sometimes, but also just like nature tracks and recordings of I guess soundscapey type things. But yeah, it is nice that with Radio New Zealand programs and things like that, you can actually put them into a podcast app. I do that too. It definitely makes it just easier to listen to and keep up with stuff, I think.
There's a really good podcast that I just remembered I should mention called New Horizons, which is done by Blind Citizens Australia. They are a very good consumer organization. They're really quite progressive. They're doing a lot of work on capacity building. They do a lot of things like leadership training and mentoring specific areas of technology advocacy, that kind of thing. And it's really, really interesting to hear what happens across the ditch. And they come out consistently every week with about, I think it's a 15-minute podcast, extremely professionally produced. And that's one I pretty much never miss.
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah.
Good tip, thank you. I should probably also mention the No Labels show that Thomas Bryan and Mike Gurley do on Access Radio. Because we don't have a whole ton of places where disabled people and people working in an area which might have an interest to the disability community are interviewed here in Aotearoa, and that's one of them. So yeah.
Áine, I was wanting, and both wanted to ask. It's kind of around your process, and I just wondered, do you have a sort of a way of going about creating a safe space for your interviewees to talk?
See, for me, it depends a lot. Some of my interviews are quite, I wouldn't say adversarial, but they're challenging. So it depends for me a lot on the interviewee. To give you an example, there's a real controversy in the disability community at the moment that particularly affects blind and low vision people, but it does affect other disabled people too. Around these companies who are putting forward this idea that if businesses will pay them a monthly fee, they will put this magical code on their website and it will make it accessible and all their dreams will come true. And this is extremely controversial technology. And recently I got the chief executive of one of these companies on the podcast. And that was a very adversarial interview. Last year, I interviewed the president of the National Federation of the Blind, which is one of the largest advocacy organizations of blind people in the world. I just got back from their convention actually and spoke to 2,500 people there, and they have been rocked by a series of sexual abuse scandals, and they had declined to talk to anybody, but they did talk to me. And in that case, it was a difficult balance because I needed to be very sensitive about the subject matter while also asking the questions that I felt the blind community had a right to have an answer to. If you are dealing with somebody who's not so used to, you can't expect them to be as media savvy. or you're talking about something where they're vulnerable, I will take every possible measure that I can to assist with something like that. So if it's a sensitive subject, where you might be talking about somebody who has suffered something, I will even, in that case, submit questions in advance and discuss how we're doing it. So for me, it really varies a lot depending on the guest.
Yeah, agree with that. And definitely appreciate you taking these accessibility overlay companies to task. Most of my interviewing has been in this, well, at least most of my kind of audio based interviewing has been with other disabled people, but specifically also about sharing their lived experience in some way. So kind of telling their stories has been the main area that I've worked in within podcasting. And for that, some of the things I tend to do is I will give people an idea of the sorts of questions in advance. And it's not prescriptive, like it's not like we will definitely not take the conversation in other ways on the day. And I do also encourage people to kind of do that and lead it towards what they're interested in within the, ambit of whatever that podcast is about. I also will tell people, because sometimes I'm talking to people who've done, a number of interviews before, but sometimes it's people who are really quite new. So I'll explain to them that we can edit. So if afterwards they're like, oh, I wish that I didn't say this little bit over here, could you take that out? That's doable. And just if we're talking about something particularly sensitive, I might ask them if there's anything that they don't want me to talk about, or if they're basically okay with the suggested questions. And I think that's in those circumstances where you're talking about people's lived experience, I think that can actually be helpful. And I can think of times myself also when I've been asked if there was something on the list of questions that I would rather not speak to, and where I've said, yeah, this one, I would prefer not to talk about this in public. I think there are some of the things that I try to do.
Great. Yeah. I just wanted to ask quickly, I just wanted to ask if you had any kind of top tips for sharing your voice, not just like podcasting or broadcasting, standing up for yourself as a disabled person, or I suppose trying to get a point across, advocating for yourself and the community. Is there anything you've learned over the years that you could share?
For me, the first thing that comes to mind, and often I find for these sorts of questions, you just go with your gut reaction. And my gut reaction to this question is always remember that you are worthy. We are subjected so often to a myriad of signals from society, from government, everybody who want to put disabled people at the bottom of the heap. And it's very difficult not to internalize that. So we always must remember our fundamental worth, and that we all have a right and an expectation to contribute to the best of our ability and to the degree that we want to society. And a fair society has the obligation to facilitate that. The other thing I would say is, if you start to yell and rant, you've probably lost the argument. It's very, very difficult. And I don't blame people who find it hard to retain their sense of control after all that they go through. But where possible, if you are able to keep a cool head and articulate your point with dignity, it tends to carry a lot more weight. Easier said than done, and there should be a lot of forgiveness when it's not possible. But those would be my two thoughts.
Yeah, I would really echo the first one in particular. And then yeah, from the advocacy standpoint, I guess what I would say is that like having a community of other disabled people who you are also able to vent with and talk about the frustrations of ableism in a way where you don't have to be like all composed and say it nicely is really useful, because then I think it helps to have an outlet for that. Obviously, the outlet doesn't have to be talking to other disabled people, but I think that can be quite a good outlet because it can be particularly validating when other people have experienced, you know, similar things and you have that sense of solidarity. But yeah, no, remembering that you're worthy is such a big one. And just also, I think remembering that there aren't wrong ways to communicate. And also that the sort of structures and deadlines and maybe ways that you know, the non-disabled kind of world tries to put us into, they don't need to always be like that. We can work in time ways and ways that are more based on the sort of timekeeping that our bodies and minds are able to actually manage more flexibly. And sometimes it feels really hard to be like, oh, is this actually possible? Everything is telling me that it's not, but to keep that vision alive of like, we are worthy of being able to like contribute and communicate and get our messages across in ways that work for us.
Yeah, ka pai. I think we may be running a bit short with the NZSL interpretation, and thank you so much for that. Does anyone have any questions before we sort of wrap things up? Anyone?
Can I just, sorry, while someone's thinking of a question, I feel like I want to give a shout out also to the D-List, which is a new starting out doing media, but will also be a wider kaupapa led unashamedly by disabled people for our community. And I think that's a really great example of what Jonathan and I were just talking about a minute ago. So it's really cool that we have this now in Aotearoa. Yeah.
Yep. We love the D-List.
Oh, wow, you've got effects.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
yeah. Sitting here in my studio, yeah. The D-List is fantastic. Red's a great guy, and they're lucky to have Olivia. I've got very high hopes for what they're doing.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Yeah, so with the advocacy work, how do you kind of find balance with that? Because sometimes it might feel like you're moving mountains.
Yeah. Sometimes advocacy feels like you're banging your head constantly against a brick wall. And then every so often you notice the wall's moved just a little bit. And I've been very lucky that, you know, while I haven't got everything I've ever wanted, I've been very fortunate to lead some really significant bits of change, and that keeps me going. You know, the victories keep me going. So, you know, all the way back in 1994, I was a just newly minted government relations manager for what was then the Blind Foundation, stating the case that access to the printed word was no different from access to physical buildings. And we got that in the Copyright Act. New Zealand was the first to do that. And eventually, you know, I was then consulted by other jurisdictions around the world, and they had similar legislation, which led to Bookshare once the US got it. And eventually there was the Marrakesh Treaty, which is about to celebrate its 10th anniversary. So to have started that ball rolling was special. All the reform that took years, how long did it take? About 8 years of the Blind Foundation itself, which was a very paternalistic structure where only 2 of the board members were directly elected by blind people. The opposition was just incredible to overcome, and the vested interests and the establishment. I can go on actually and look at a whole lot of things where I know I was able to help make a difference. And so you savor the victories to give you strength for the victories that don't work out.
I think another part of it for me has been surrounding myself, A, with disabled community, but B, with great non-disabled allies as well. And I think we're always learning, and it's not to sort of look for perfection, but look for other non-disabled people who are really willing to back you up and to give you space as a disabled person. I think that can be really, it can just feel like a much more kind of safe and generative space to be advocating in. Yeah. But I totally agree about celebrating the wins and holding on to them, because and also celebrating the wins which might not be where you ultimately want to get to, but where you can see, oh, there's been this really great step. Like we've moved a little bit, and that's worth keeping a hold of.
Awesome. Did you have a question, Robin?
No, I was just going to make on the Marrakesh Treaty that in fact we've still got a long way to go on that, because we've been actually, disabled people have been attacked by particularly well-known writer in New Zealand that we had to make a response to. So we've still got a wee way to go with that, but we've got the treaty, so that's starting.
Yeah. Did you want to repeat that into the microphone at all, or?
That would be a great idea.
Yeah, I don't know if the cable's long enough, but yeah. Robin takes over.
No, I was just going to say that we've got a wee way to go yet with Marrakesh.
Yes.
Because we actually, you might not know this, but the writing publication, the New Zealand Author, we had quite a nasty attack on disabled people from a very well-known author. And we had to, fortunately, Quip the Lit were able to respond, and we did quite firmly. But we've still got a wee way to go for people to understand all this stuff. But we've got the treaty, and that's really the starting point. We've got to win the access thing next.
We have, and I should probably not name the individual concerned because they're now deceased, and I'm good like that. But when I was doing the original work on the Copyright Act, I got a call from this very well-known New Zealand luminary who was in charge, I think it was like the Authors or Publishers Association or something like that. It was like a peak body. And he called me, and I remember very distinctly picking up the phone in my office, and he said, do you steal property off everybody, or is it only authors you steal from? And he was outraged at the idea that without consent, we might be able to record or braille or otherwise modify the work of New Zealand authors. And, I said to him, well, we could go the other way. We could actually require all of the authors and publishers in this country to publish all of their material in an accessible format, which we maybe should have. And he said, but that would cost a fortune. And I said to him, exactly, you might want to quit while you're ahead. So, there's always been that battle there, and I'm sure it will continue.
Robin's talking about books were born accessible.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a strange thing because they largely are these days. So every book starts life in some sort of electronic system. And so I'm really not sure why we haven't made more progress.
Do you think it's making things easier for people to kind of, do their own audiobooks, or is it more kind of like educating people why are we doing audiobooks, like because it makes it accessible for a whole heap of people? And like it makes me wonder how many podcasts out there don't have transcripts. And it might be because they don't really know that accessibility is the reason. Like, how do you kind of do you do transcripts for your podcasts?
Oh gosh, absolutely, yeah. I didn't initially, mainly because I couldn't work out how to fund it, and I eventually found ways to fund it. Living Blindfully has been through a bit of a metamorphosis this year, and we now have a premium tier, which doesn't provide any sort of exclusive content, because I really didn't want to exclude disabled people who genuinely couldn't subscribe. It doesn't sit well with me. But we do have people, about 20% of our audience pays something. And with our model, it's pay what you can or pay what you think it's worth. So there's no flat subscription fee. And that has allowed me to pay for audio editors and transcribers and just take the load off me a bit. But prior to that, we got funding from Internet NZ. In terms of why people don't do it, I think sometimes there's genuine ignorance, sometimes they don't care. And also it is quite costly. Machine generated transcripts are better quality now than they've ever been. But in New Zealand in particular, once you get out of, say, the British or American accent, they tend to be more unreliable. And so there are a range of barriers there.
Yeah, I think for me, so when I was doing a kind of independent podcast series in 2021, I started off doing my own transcripts, but I didn't really have capacity. So ended up like putting together a little volunteer team of friends, and there was enough people that the work could be divided up quite a lot. Like even one episode that was maybe 45 minutes, I could split that between 3 people and be like, okay, can you do from the start to 15 minutes and you do from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And so it would make it more manageable. And then in other projects I've worked on, they've been with organizations. And so there's been some funding there, and I've, always talked up front, and sometimes the organizations have also been very aware of that themselves, coming from a disability perspective, that it really is important to resource the creation of transcripts. And yes, it's certainly true that the auto-generated transcripts, in terms of bias in, bias out or whatnot, with the data, do really nicely usually with North American accents, and pretty good with British accents, and then maybe okayish with other native English accents, and just downhill from there. So depending on the transcript, and also for people working in other languages too, it can be still a fairly time intensive task. So it is quite important to account for that, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Just keeping an eye on time with the NZSL. Is there anything else you kind of wanted to touch base on, in terms of like sharing your voice? Just any advice?
To wrap, I just encourage people to explore podcasting as a way of sharing their voice. One of the things I'm really pleased about is that things are so much easier now than they were when I first started podcasting back in 2004. It was a very, very geeky thing. Now there are devices that are designed for podcasting to mean that those who don't have a lot of expertise with audio can create a really good quality podcast without too much effort or expense. Publishing a podcast is easier than ever, and there are free options out there now. And it's a rewarding, all-consuming hobby, really. And for me, I just consider it a tremendous responsibility. I know that what happens on Living Blindfully, makes a difference. We're listened to in some pretty influential places, and I take that seriously. But look, it's not necessarily about that. It's about finding a way of expressing yourself. And again, it comes back to being worthy, about having a place that's yours for you to be your authentic self and share that with the world.
Total cool.
Yeah, totally cool. That. And I would just add, share yourself in every way that feels comfortable to you, and that can have a disability angle. It can not have a disability angle. It can be a lot more intersectional. If the more that you're able to find the spaces where you can do that, the better. And it's also totally fine if like being in public is not so much the way you want to do that, right? But having some kind of expressive form, some kind of outlet, that works for you, maybe that's creative or maybe that's related to media or whatnot, is so valuable.
Awesome. Hey, just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your voice. And thank you so much to the NZSL interpreter.
Thank you.
Just a huge thank you from us to you. Cool.
Yeah,
everyone
thanks,
say
Sam.
Thanks
Thanks
for
for the great
hosting
questions.
the conversation.
Good to work with you, Áine.
You
Yeah.
too, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a beautiful night.